Now, the reason the air is different in the winter than the summer, if I tell you that the air in the winter is 100% relative humidity, and I tell you the air in the summer is 100% relative humidity, you'll say, oh, it's 100%, it's the same. It's not the same. It's actually completely different. So 100% in the winter is the equivalent of me taking a sponge, tightening it up, shoving it into the water, and actually taking it out while my hand is on top of that sponge and telling you it's 100% full of water, because it is. But the amount of available space on that sponge to absorb water is restricted by my hand. If I take that same sponge and I open it up and I drop it in, it will double the amount of water it can pull up from that sponge. Well, air is the same thing. So at 100% relative humidity at minus 20 degrees, for every 10 degrees you heat that air up, you double the moisture holding capacity. It's massive. So it's actually one of the nicest things that we have. So people will say, oh, it's really hard to ventilate when it's in Alberta minus 30 or Saskatchewan. Actually, you know what? It's probably harder to ventilate in BC when it's the opposite, because they actually don't have the ability to suck up moisture when air comes in at 70% relative humidity when it's raining outside and the temperature is 10 or 11 degrees. They don't have enough room to heat that air up in order to turn that water into a sponge, or that air into a sponge. So it's extremely important that we bring that cold air that's heavy, and we throw it in, and as it moves along the barn and along the roof and further into the middle, it actually starts to heat up. And every 10 degrees it heats, it has a double the moisture holding capacity. That's how you dry your barns out. And Alberta farmers have the ability to have the driest barns, and in fact, you can actually run 2 dry barns in the winter if you do this right. So the idea that every winter I have to have a wet barn that I walk through and slop from 5 feet from the inlet across the barn, and it keeps gravitating across and across and across to the middle, you don't have to live with that. That is actually just because our ventilation isn't running properly. If you run it right with proper static, you'll actually have a barn that's too dry, and you'll actually have to go the opposite way to try and bring the dust out of the air. So it's extremely important, and we have the tools at our disposal. It's natural in our area, so we actually have the ability to do that. Okay, so obviously you need to change ventilation rates at the other time of the year. So when I talked about summer or winter and the ability to bring that cold air in, the summer is the exact same, except you can bring in higher volumes of air. And the more air you bring, the faster you bring it in. If you have enough volume, you'll actually create a cooling effect. Okay, in the winter, something that's really important is to be able to use heat. When I talked about heating up that air coming in, you'll notice that bullet that came up there. I set an we call it sort of an overset, or basically you're taking your temperature point and you're shooting above that temperature point with your temperature. So all of us know what we're doing. Each one of us, some of them are called hysterias, some of them are called offsets. There's all different kinds of names for them. But essentially, when you're running your computer, you want the ability to put in extra heat in the winter time so that you can use heat to your advantage. So that'll actually help when it comes to that. This chart is a busy chart. It's a busy chart because we're in Canada, and this one here is the only one I could find that had both metric and imperial all on it at the same time. I can't tell you enough how important these charts are. Now this may seem really, really complicated to you, but this chart tells you everything you need to know about water, volume, dew points, wet bulb temperature, dry bulb temperature, and other things that we don't need in our industry. However, if I had the ability, and I could have, but I didn't, set it up. Anybody that can see, well, you guys won't be able to see it. Okay, along the bottom, you have the dry bulb temperature. So if you look at that dry bulb temperature, and you need 2 points of reference. So your dry bulb, everyone has it in on your controller. Everybody also has relative humidity. So I want you to look at these lines that go up like this. These are your relative humidity lines. Okay, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. When you take your barn temperature and you plot it, so if you plot at 30 degrees Celsius and you go up there at, let's say, 60%, there's your number right there. That's your dew point level. And that's your wet bulb temperature. These diagonal lines are dew point temperatures. Now, if I'm sitting at that level, in order for me to get the exact same wet bulb temperature with less humidity, I need to go up in temperature significantly to make that happen. So follow that diagonal line from your point to understand the difference when it comes to your barn. So if you're running a barn, and I go to barns all the time, this is one of the hardest things that we have as farmers. We all talk to our neighbors. So we'll call up Joe down the road and say, how did you do this cycle? Oh, I did the best flock in my life. Whoa, what did you do? Well, I changed my ventilation. Oh, okay. Well, what did you do? Well, I brooded my birds at 28 degrees Celsius. It was unbelievable. So the other guy goes back, well, if it worked for him, it better work for me. So he goes and sets his barn at 28 degrees and almost wrecks his flock. What he failed to notice is that the other guy had humidified his environment up to 70%, and 28 degrees Celsius at 80 or 70% was outstanding. So you have to understand that principle in order to understand what your farmer friend has just told you about his barn environment. Now, there is a limit to this. If you follow these lines and you find, as I said earlier at the beginning, there is a perfect optimum zone for birds. If you follow one of these lines and you take it at a perfect optimum, and everybody knows it's all published, there's lots of knowledge out there for it. If we look at 50 to 60%, and you guys looked at it, so let's say 55%, or even 60. So we take 60%, we follow that line, and we take our temperature, and once that intersects, we have our line. If your barn is sitting at 30% relative humidity and your chicks are on the way, follow that line all the way over until you hit your temperature, and you find out what you're supposed to be brooding at to create a feels-like temperature. Okay? When you go further across this line, you'll realize that it's almost impossible with really low humidity to get those birds to the proper feels-like temperature. And it's one of the biggest problems we have in Alberta, Saskatchewan, even BC for that matter. It's one of the biggest problems we have, and we actually have early chilling in most of our flocks. So you have the chart there. You can look at it. There's all kinds of ways to learn how to be able to follow one of these. But needless to say, they're fantastic to show it. Remember what I talked earlier about the amount of humidity and cold air? Look at the far left side here. There's your 0 degrees Celsius, 100% relative humidity. Look what happens. You go all the way over. This line right here in the black, that actually tells you how much water is in that air. So each time you heat it up 10 degrees, you're doubling the amount of water you can hold in that air. So you can follow it across. So on the far left side, I would much rather have this air coming into my barn in the winter than this air coming into my barn in the winter, because I can actually use it to dry a barn easier.